Alrighty, this time we are talking about the Jakarta NoSQL spec and how we can take advantage of this in our application. So take it away.
So the Jakarta NoSQL spec is, if you've ever used JPA, so the persistence annotations or something, persistence something, that's used for relational databases, that one's a venerable spec. It's been around at least 20 years probably. That's a system where it handles the mapping between the storage database and your objects. So in that case, it's an ORM, object relational mapping, where it says you have a Java class that it represents an employee that has first name, last name, title, etc. And then you have a database table that has first name, last name, title, etc. It handles the mapping between those. It will also handle querying, trying to do that in an efficient way. And that's been there for a very long time. The Jakarta NoSQL spec is newer and much like MVC, in progress. So it's not part of the official specifications yet, but it is part of Jakarta, the organization. It is on the spec list. It just hasn't been part of Jakarta EE 9 or earlier yet. But it is meant to be like JPA, but for NoSQL databases like our beloved Domino, and with learning some of the lessons and improving on some of the things that basically JPA is just older than. So it's very much meant to work well with CDI in particular. So it does a lot of very interesting magic that will be beyond the scope of this video, but there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on. But then once you know how to do it, it starts to make sense. And fortunately, as a developer, and fortunately for me too, we don't actually have to implement all that stuff. We just have to know that it's there and that it works. So that's the concept of it. And I'll show you a little bit of like how this looks in practice. So, right now I'm just showing a table of, extremely poorly formatted stuff. And like, well, showing a table of document entries, not interesting on its own. What gets more interesting is how this all ties together. So I'll start with where you would start if you're writing to this specification, probably, where you have my entity. So a lot of these terms, entity and column and ID, are taken directly from JPA because people writing to that spec would be familiar with them. And so this is those versions. So entity is the generic term for like, this is a business object. So here it's person, it could be employee, company. And in Domino, this will almost always correspond to a form. So where you would have a person form or a company form, here you have entity as a class. And so what you're doing is defining this is the Java object. And so a lot of us have done this with XPages, where we'll do, either you call them data access objects or other mechanisms for defining your business logic models as Java classes. And so usually when we'd be doing that, we'd either have them either produced by something that knows about Domino and handles mapping between them, or we will have code in here that will say load from document or something like that. But the way this works, like JPA before it, is that you annotate this up saying this is ID, and for Domino, this specifically means the UNID. In a different environment, it might mean something else. So in a relational database, this would usually be the primary key, often an int, something like that. But for Domino, it means the UNID, and then you start specifying columns. So again, think of column like a relational table. Here it's items or fields, but here you're just saying this field is a string value and it goes to the first name. This one's a last name. I'm working on adding date time support. Currently, this doesn't actually work, but that'll be there. The idea there will be that support these different Domino data types and map them back there. So at the very least, it's the idea is to support the standard kind of stuff you'd run into, numbers and strings and things like that. But this is the entirety of the model, and you'll note that the vast majority of the code here is just Java boilerplate, because until records in Java 14, something or other like that, there was no way to just say, I just want to have getters and setters, you handle that for me, other than Lombok. So here, the vast majority of your model object is just boilerplate that Java has to do to have getters and setters. So the idea here is that this class does not know anything about the database that it's being stored in, nor does it need to. You might eventually, in edge cases, have some things that know how to convert between a Domino thing and this, but the goal is to have it so that this class is independent of the database. Now, it will be in Domino. It's in an NSF. You're probably not going to use like Mongo in here. You could, but you probably won't. But the idea is that it's independent of that. because that way you don't have to worry about the specifics of, like, beyond saying it's this item name and it's this type, you don't want to have to worry about the specifics of how it's getting there, how that's being efficiently done, if that's using the lotus.domino stuff, if it's using something else, whatever. Like, that's not important. Like, your job as a developer here is to have a person class that has a first and last name. Your job should not be doc.replace item value, doc.get item value string. Like, that is incidental to the work you're doing. You are writing an app that deals with an entity called person or an entity called company. So you focus on just, I'm going to write this entity, I'll gussy it up a little bit, and then the system will handle everything else for me. And boy, does the system handle a lot of stuff for you. So
yeah, I'm very interested to see. Let's see this.
yeah. So just on its own, you have this class called person, but that doesn't tell you anything about where it's coming from, how they can be queried, any of that kind of stuff. That comes in with the other JNoSQL concept, which is the repository interface. And so what this is that you extend this standardized repository interface, which will kind of for free get you get by ID, delete by ID, et cetera, like a couple standardized things. And then it has some real CDI magic that goes on here in two ways. One way is that there is no implementation class for this interface.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need to know how that works, but you do. It is nice to know that the only thing I'm writing to query people here is this person repository. I'm not writing person repository impl. I'm not actually writing any of these things. What is going on in the back end is via CDI magic. It has a couple standardized behaviors, but then beyond that, it looks at these method names and parses them. And it says, okay, well, I know that if you have find all, that's just going to get all entries. So that's easy enough. That's going to be a common standardized sort of thing to do. And then here, if I have find all that takes a sorts, which is a JNoSQL class that will allow you to say sort by first name, sort by last name, whatever, it says, well, if I have this as a parameter, I know how to deal with that too. Like, you as a developer don't need to do anything special. And then find by last name, like, well, find by last name means, I want to find them, and then it's by, so it's going to be a field name following it, and last name is the property name. So it knows that
Get
this is
out
going
of
to be
here.
the last name. Because
So
this is all
literally whatever you have in your model, you could say find by and pull out whatever entity, whatever.
Right. Because we have computers. We can have computers do this stuff for us. So
CDI magic, like you've been saying, this is crazy.
Like, there are naturally limits. Like, it only handles the things that it was written to handle, and so you do have capabilities for extending this. There are mechanisms for adding like custom per database functionality. You can write your own implementations that have some extra stuff, so you can extend this. But for the basic stuff that you're going to do almost all the time, like,
Wow.
find by last name is an extremely parsable thing. And so you can just write that and it will say, well, this is a standardized way to do it. And so the idea is, if you write things the way that almost all developers were writing them anyway, you get this behavior. And so again, there's no implementation class for this. This is the only thing I write for handling how to access person documents.
I was going to say that is an exceptionally short set of code there.
Yes. Yeah. And
Wow.
Fortunately, I find, because certainly whenever you're going for like very short, terse code, you can go too far. Like, there is a little bit of this where it's like, if you don't know that this magic is going to happen, it boggles your mind. Like, for example, this spec was my first encounter with CDI. So I was trying to like look through this, like, so where do you write the code? Where is the code that you write? Like, how can it possibly do this? I had no idea. Fortunately, I've learned that it's like, oh, CDI does let you do these things. So this is one of those ones where it was like, I was just racking my brain trying to figure out, like, how is this even possible? There's no code. Like, how does it do anything? But then I learned, oh, it can kind of do on the fly interpretation of code and create things and handle incoming requests. And now it's like, oh, okay, this makes some more sense. Just knowing that it's possible makes sense. Because at first I didn't even know this was a thing. So I was like, well, obviously there has to be an implementation class somewhere. No. Because it's able to figure all this stuff out by the code. Like, it's the minimum amount, but it's still like, when you look at this, once you know that the magic is possible, looking at this makes sense. Like, there's going to be one that says find all and you get a stream of person entities. There's one that finds all with sorts. Like, it's very easy to read. And so you know what it's doing once you understand that it can do it, which is the hurdle here.
Very cool.
So there, with those two classes, those tiny classes, I now have access to person documents. I can do, all my CRUD operations. I can query and I can sort and all these sorts of things. And then the next task is to actually use it. So over here, I have a basic REST service that will use the by query last name. So here I'm passing in last name equals Fusen. And so it searched through the database and it found one document. If I go over to the, over here, I see this is a REST service. So the same JAX-RS stuff that's going on before. Query parameter is last name. So I say, I just call person repository.find by last name, and I pass in this query parameter that I got, and then I collect them into a list, and then that's what's here in this JSON. So this is piecing all those things together. What I'm doing here is I'm saying inject, so CDI, the managed bean mechanism, I'm saying give me an implementation for person repository, and CDI does its magic to make one up. And what I'm saying is just give me that, and then that will be available. And then now I can just call find by last name and combine this all. And then this also builds on the JSON processing stuff we talked about before, where it knows how to turn, all these specs are coming together. Where we have all these
this is ridiculous. I think of all the code that I've written, right? Database, DB current equals session.get current database, all
exactly.
of that crap. Oh,
yep.
Man.
Yep. And so the idea here is that in theory, up to a point at least, with this, you should not have to deal with the API objects. So session, database, all that crap, you shouldn't have to deal with it.
All goes away. Wow.
Right. And part of this, some of this stuff is magic coming from CDI. Some of it's magic coming from the NoSQL spec. Some of it, and like the reason why, because years ago I had written a Domino driver for this that used just db.search. And we'll say that was not performant, would be a nice way to put that. But now we have DQL and we have query results processor. And so combining these, now I can do these performant ad hoc queries, and I can do things like sorting and have that be efficient, at least after the first request, and have these things like now, it's like I can actually do these arbitrary queries. And so this all comes together, and now I can make a real driver for this.
Awesome. Absolutely awesome.
And so now if I go here to combine this, so I mentioned in the MVC video that some of the payoff for MVC will happen in this video. So this is that. So what this page is a very poorly formatted, but that's just because I didn't put any CSS onto it. But this is a document listing. So this is very similar to a view panel or something like that, where you'd add delete actions and whatnot. This happens to be done with JSP. It's kind of incidental to this one. But here I have the ability to create new documents. It's the standard kind of CRUD stuff. I think I can't delete them because I'm anonymous. That's reasonable, which is important to know because this is Domino data security. So this is obeying the ACL, all of this stuff. Like if you're doing anything with a database, like it is acting as the current user. It takes the current session, it acts as that user. If there are reader fields, that user can't see those documents. If there are author fields that allow them to write to them, then they can. Like all of this stuff, it's all happening with the normal Domino API. Like, so awesome. This is not an end run around security at all. It is those same operations happening on the user's behalf. So it's all the same stuff. So all of the Domino security rules are completely there because it's still Domino. It's all the same stuff beneath the covers here. But here you saw those CRUD operations. And then, so if I go back to the Java class that does this, which is, it's one of these things. Was that the NoSQL? Yeah, it was the same one. So I had the JSON producing one earlier, but then these other ones are marked as controllers. So here I can say I want to, and then this is the first page here, person list. Or if I go here, it's app NoSQL list, and that's this endpoint. The path is list. And what I'm saying is for the models, if I don't have any incoming sort column, just do find all and then put them in a list. If I do have an incoming sort column, make a sorting by ascending. Here you can do descending and all that sort of thing, and you can combine them. So you do cascading sorts, that sort of thing. And so that's how I can do this to click and sort by different things. What's happening in the back end here is that I'm doing the DQL query, and then I'm doing a query results process saying, oh, if it's sorted, then do a QRP search saying sort by this. So I'm translating that to the back end mechanism. So as query results processor gets faster, this gets faster. So this is using the built-in now as of 12.01 capabilities. And again, this month, February 2022, we will have an OpenNTF webinar on query results processor. So pay attention to that. If it's coming up, attend it. If it is in the past, watch it. I hope you attended it, or watch it on the OpenNTF website. So that one should be good. So this is using all that stuff. So the latest stuff that's coming in, this uses those capabilities to make this doable and make it fast. So this is using all that under the covers. So, but now back to these other actions. So I clicked on that, and so that's a GET request that fetches that. Great, whatever. And then if I have the create new, this is just another basic. Whatever. I have the create new. This is just a basic JSP. But what that does is when you actually go to create on the JSP file, I have a form saying the action will be create, so that will return back to this URL. Here are my input fields, and then I submit it. That posts back here. So now I have a method marked as post. This is the thing that handles it. So this is as opposed to something like on XPages, where you would say, take these fields that are bound to an object, and then the button saves it, and then the XPage runtime handles the back and forth of like, this is the current state of it. It knows how to bind all this stuff, which in this case, is not bad. Like, I'm not saying that this is a like clear, like do this all the time instead of XPages, but it is different. It is interesting to know these two things, and they both have their purposes. Because for example, here where I'm having a post that accepts URL encoded stuff, you could use this as an API. You could have one that accepts JSON as an incoming thing. And you could have your same class here take a post either from a browser that has URL encoded stuff, or you could take it from an API client that takes JSON. And so you write both of them here and it'd be all centralized. Like this is your person controller in this case, where it handles all the operations dealing with person documents. And so all your querying, you could say, here's the web browser version, here's the API client version, different output. But the same kind of concepts where you're coming in, you can share a lot of code, and you can share a lot of this kind of stuff. And so here I'm saying, when this happens, create a new person object, bind these things in. You can also do things with bean parameters and fancier things like that, and then save this and then return a redirect back to the list. So you create a new one, you go back to the list. Then that's how you handle this stuff. So that's where in MVC, these are things that you would do in XPages. Like in XPages, you might have a redirect rule, or you'd have an action on a button that says now go back to this other page. Here at the end of this request, you'd say redirect to this other one, and that will handle the redirect in there. So you're writing to the request, the action, and then that handles going back and forth to the browser. So you're writing much more at the HTTP level rather than at kind of the conceptualized JSF XPages level. Similarly, I have a delete action. Here, there's a to-do for me to fix something up, but like the idea is once everything's working properly, it will be routed to this automatically. Like if you do a browser request, it has an underscore method thing that handles pretending, because browsers don't do delete from a form natively, but it handles routing to that. The idea is here, now I have it at delete, and similarly, this will work great for MVC. This will work great as a REST API. It's the same thing. You're using the same spec, the same code. So this is all the sort of stuff I do in my blog as well, where I have you visit it with a web browser, but I also use Mars Edit for editing, and I have implemented an API as JaxRS that sits right next to the controller class. And like these are things, it's all the same kind of code. It's all very consistent. It all uses NoSQL as the backend to deal with the data. And so the idea here is that you will have these delete operations and delete and other operations. And this is all like, none of the stuff on this page has anything to do with Domino. Like there's no lotus.domino, there's no other API stuff going on. It is obviously on Domino, it's running on Domino, it's accessing Domino data, but you don't have to write to that. You don't have to care that it's a document. You don't have to care that in the backend it's doing DQL and query results processor and figuring out the most efficient way to read that and saying, oh, if there's a sort, do it this way. If there's not, do it this other way. Doesn't matter, not your problem. Like that's the Stacks problem. And that's the point, where like now you're just writing your entities that will be stored in the database. They'll be read from the database the same way that you want them to be, but you don't have to write all of that implementation glue code. That's where all this stuff comes in, and as you write this. And incidentally, even though I've kind of bound NoSQL with MVC and JSP, they're not actually bound. Like, so NoSQL, it does not depend on MVC. It doesn't depend on JaxRS. It's its own thing. The only thing it depends on is CDI for all that weird magic. You can do it in an XPage as well. So I have an XPage over here that, I haven't fleshed it out as much, but this is an XP data table that's showing the entries from here. So if I go to the XPage itself, it's an XPage. So what it's doing is I have a bean here. So there's a person repository bean that has a getter. XPages on its own doesn't understand streams because they never added that. But I have a bean here that will provide this kind of like my communication between the newer layer and XPages. But it will say, give me all of the person documents. I could add whatever the heck other queries I want onto there, and then it's now an iterable and it will work here. If I had a
Wow.
button that said, person.delete, or no, it wouldn't be, it would be person repository.delete and then past that, that'll work. Like none of that stuff that I was talking about is specific to MVC or REST services. Like you can use this as your layer in XPages. That's the intent. Like these are all just Java beans that are all floating around in the background. XPages is a participant in that just as much as MVC is, just as much as JAX-OS is. Like in, going back to the MicroProfile, all that stuff will work there too. If you had a method on your model object that needed to have a timeout for some reason, like you could add that there. All these things fit together and they're built together, and they all do also work with XPages. So that kind of ties that together where, this is all still in an NSF, same class, all the same stuff that's going on here, but saving you a lot of work. So you can use all this NoSQL stuff with XPages. You can use all this JAX-RS stuff alongside it, all working with the same beans, all working in the same class space. It's all coming together. So as I flesh out NoSQL some more, I'm going to add attachment support. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to add date time support. The goal is to make this to be like, this is the way to do data access. Like the ways that we have with XPages are wildly deficient in a lot of ways. This is a much, much better way to do that. And this can work with any normal XPage you're doing. So this ties in perfectly with the existing technologies that we've been using the whole time.
Awesome.